Thank you. Welcome everybody to the October JavaSIG meeting. Thanks for showing up. It's a mediocre weather day, so that means we have a lot of people here. Usually, if it's really good or really bad, people don't show up. But I'm glad you all made it. So we have a really great speaker tonight, Matt, to talk about comparing REST frameworks. So it's really cool, especially for me, since I'm looking at a lot of machine learning REST APIs, and I'm getting like, you know, this one, that one's faster, more secure, this and that. So I'm interested in this topic myself. I want to thank Betterment for hosting us. So thank you very much. Let's give a round of applause to Betterment. Thank you very much for hosting us. And I wanted to thank Matt's Okta, Matt's company, for the pizza. So thank you, Matt and Okta. Thank you. Any announcements? So just a small announcement. So we have a group of leaders, very, very excellent leaders that's helped nurture and grow the group over the past 7 years, 8 years. And Gene, Barry, you know, Sai, Rodrigo, Neha. We're always looking for new people to help out. So if you're interested in helping out to grow the JavaSIG and to help the next generation of developers learn about Java, please reach out to us. And we're all ears. Well, we need all the help we can get. It takes more than just 7 people to run this thing. Okay, does anybody have any open questions you want to bring up on Java before we turn everything over to Matt? Okay, so just a quick thing. So I'm in the process of, you know, everybody's machine learning crazy. So I gave a talk on machine learning a couple of months ago. It was back in March, I think, about an intro to machine learning and ChatGPT APIs, all that stuff. So what I did is that I've created a chatbot that understands your private documentation. Instead of using Python like everybody else on the planet, I use Java tools. So I'm able to do that. So I want to give a talk on that so you understand what I did and you could enhance it and take it further. So hopefully that'll be in the beginning of next year. So let me turn everything over to Matt to talk about a bunch of REST APIs. Oh, it's it's right in front of me.
I don't have a whole lot to say, but I will say thank you for coming. My name is Greg Potter. I'm a principal engineer here at Betterment. We are the largest independent robo-advisor working to make people's financial lives a little bit better. We have a bunch of different teams here. We're using Java mostly on our back-end custody and trading systems, and we're hiring. And thanks for being here. And now I'll hand it over to Matt because I want to hear which REST framework's best.
See if I can get this on here correctly. Last night I used a paper clip to clip the mic on, and it worked, right? Is this how to do it, or is there? Oh, it's like over the ear thing, right? Like that. All right. So it's being live streamed. So the first thing I have to do, because my boss, you know, doesn't always trust that I'm working, is take a selfie. So if you actually want an API or anything like that, like duck out of the room and you won't be in it. But otherwise, I need you to pretend like you're happy to be here. And then, you know, it'll look good for me. So, you know, we're going to go this way. Sorry, you guys sat in the wrong spot. You're not going to be in it. And you're going to pretend like you're happy to be here. Ready? 1, 2, 3. All right. Now we have that out of the way. I can do my speaker notes. I got to work it on my phone tonight. So keynote, remote. All right. So welcome to choosing the right Java REST framework. And I did this talk at the Philly Jug on Tuesday night. The biggest difference was it had a different title because I think Frank might run them through ChatGPT before he posts them on the site. So when he sent me the new title and description, I was, wow, that's a lot better than mine, right? So if you look on the site, that was it's not shared. Sorry about that. Let's see here. Zoom, share, go. Now we're doing it right. The screen sharing thing, we'll put that like, well, sorry, you gotta live with that. Can you hide it? All right. Got my clicker here. No? Well. Water, and I had to walk 1.5 miles to the bus stop. Story. My parents actually still live there. They built a new house to retire in. It's still a log cabin, but it actually has indoor plumbing now. So they moved up in the world. They're still off grid, and I've talked to my dad about, hey, maybe we could get you electricity, and your retirement wouldn't be so bad. And he's like, well, then what would I do? Because he basically maintains the generators and keeps the solar panels running and all that. Trish and awesome Abby and Jack. We're dated on our family photo because Jack is now 6 inches taller than I am, and he's a freshman at CU. So with and all, he picked a good time to college at CU, but he did actually select that school before Coach Prime decided to go there. So he just got lucky. 2004 for $10,000. I drove him back from. And it took 14 years to make him look like this, 7 different stops in Colorado. The Porsche wheels are an indicator of the Porsche engine and transmission. So 250 horsepower makes him a lot of fun to drive. Tired of waiting after those 14 years. So I ended up buying a camper van as well because, I like classic Volkswagen. So if you have a similar problem with classic Volkswagen, I'd love to talk to you after because I have an expensive. I work. The first 3 years that I actually worked there. Ago, OAuth 0, and I love Eugenio is also classic Volkswagens. He's so I sent him pictures of mine right after I won Best of Show in the largest VW show in Colorado and said, what's yours look like? And he sent me back a pan. Right, no wheels, no tires, no body, nothing. He's got some work to do. We're going to talk about why Java. And the reason I put that in there is just because I've done this presentation a couple times at non-Java events. So you got to sell it to the Node people and the Python folks and all that. And then we'll talk about how to build REST APIs. I'll touch a bit on GraphQL APIs. We'll see how to secure your APIs with OAuth 2.1. I'll show you how to build these various frameworks with Docker and then how to with GraalVM. Open source. Okay, the code is available. Many popular open source frameworks and tools, and it's used by many large enterprises like Netflix, eBay, IBM, Microsoft, Okta, Tesla, and Apple. And 2 customers that use OAuth 0 to do login for all of their stuff is Netflix and ChatGPT. So we can scale. SDK man, that's on the next from Oracle, or you can download from Adoptium if you like the old way. The SDK man, especially if you're switching ADKs, because it just makes it so easy. They even support. You can just do SDK install Java 21-open, and it'll actually install it. If you do SDK install Java, just so it defaults to 21-TEM, which stands for Temurin. So I feel bad for the Eclipse folks, right? Because they had Adoptium. Adoptium A. It would be at the top of the list if you did SDK list Java, but they changed it to Temurin, with T like way down at the bottom of the list. So if you ever name like an open source project or anything, right, it'll be at the top of the list. Presents the 12th feature release since we started doing monthly releases every, after JDK 9, we started, the cadence is really up a lot since JDK 8. That was out in 2014. It took 3 years for 2017. I don't think I put Java 7 on this slide because I think that was like 2008, right? There was a huge gap between, you know, the old school and the new school. Oops, scam likely. I wanted to say that during the presentation, giving out swag. So first of all, I got some stickers up here if anyone wants stickers. I also got some mini books that say Angular mini book, but it's Spring Boot as well, and it's got a lot of Kotlin code in it. And then I got these dongles here. So I reward you for questions. If no one asks questions, I'm just going to throw them out. I'm not taking them home, right? This presentation was all motivated by Dan on the Okta developer blog. And you can see it was in 2020 before the pandemic hit there in January. And it became very popular because, you know, people were intrigued by seeing how to build a REST API with Spring Boot, how to do it with Quarkus, and how to do it with Micronaut. And that's all. People liked it. So one of the things that came out of that was the Oracle folks came to me and said, could you include Helidon? And I was like, you know, my opinion is Helidon wasn't really in the top 3, but sure, I'll add it. So I wrote a new blog post. Oh, wait, I'm getting ahead of myself. So I took that blog post, you can see 2021, so a year and a half later, and made a GraalVM version of it. And it just had Spring Boot, Micronaut, and Quarkus in there. And then the Helidon folks I talked to, and I wrote another one. I was a bit hesitant about adding it because my gut feel was that it wasn't that popular within the community and not a whole lot of people were using it. That turns out to be true, but I still keep it in here because it's always fun to bag on one of them, right? And so I always actually find something when I update this presentation as well with one of the frameworks. So last time when I did Chicago in August, it was actually Quarkus. And what I found was Quarkus was 30% slower between the previous release and the release I was testing. So this was, I think, you know, a 2. Version, and they released 3. And then I was, you know, doing some comparison tests, and that blew my mind, right? I was like 30% slower. How did they not catch this? And turns out I was using Gradle. That was part of it. They were testing mostly Maven. And then someone had committed a bunch of configuration stuff that slowed startup time down. So it was a great story because me just updating a simple presentation identified a regression, right, in the latest version of Quarkus. So who cares about startup time, right? That might be a thing in the Java space where you're like, we start up our app server, or we start up our jar, right? Because we often put app servers in our jars now, and it just runs for months and you don't really care about startup time, right? Well, if you're doing serverless, then it's a whole different ballgame, right? Because serverless, basically you start it, it processes a request, and then you stop it and you're done, right? And so if you're a company that's embracing serverless and you have a large cloud bill, it can be in the millions of dollars. So if you trim that down to 60%, all of a sudden you're saving millions of dollars, right? So that's why serverless is important. And basically Node and Python are kind of eating Java's lunch there. So, you know, if we can combat it by having GraalVM that actually compiles our Java applications to native, then we can compete with these other frameworks. So it's all about money, really. And no one likes to see money flying out the window if you don't have to. And so Dan Vega put together this nice diagram I like about where JVM is better and where native is better. So he basically says, if you're doing JVM based stuff, you know, for high traffic websites, it's going to work great. If you have a large memory and CPU usage, that's great. Frequent deployments, big monolithic application, things of that sort, then, you know, use the JVM. Don't even bother with native. But if you're doing microservices or Kubernetes or back office stuff, you might want to look into it. And then if you really have low memory or low CPU, or maybe you're even on devices, right, then Graal can really help you a lot. Functions as a service, to me, that's serverless, or scale to 0, where it basically only starts when a request comes in. So the first one, let me just make sure I didn't skip any up. To get started with Micronaut, I recommend SDK Man, because I always have it installed on my machine. You can just do SDK install Micronaut, and then you can do mn as the command, create app, specify a package name. The last part of that name will be the name of the app. I tried to do Micronaut. They don't allow that. So you can't name your app Micronaut. You have to name it something else. So I just chose app. And then the features that I added were security JWT and Micronaut AOT for ahead of time compiling. That was based on the Micronaut folks' recommendation as far as Micronaut AOT. Originally, I never had it in there. They were like, if you really want to speed things up, add it. And then the security JWT is because what I'm going to build or show you today is just a simple hello REST point. But that hello REST is, or that endpoint is secured by OAuth. And so you have to pass in an access token to it to actually access it. So they don't call it OAuth in a lot of sense. In a lot of cases, they just call it JWT, which is funny because JWT, actually OAuth doesn't require JWT for access tokens. It's just one of the ways of implementing it. So if you're more of a visual person, you can go to micronaut.io/launch. They give you, similar options. You specify the application type, the Micronaut version, the Java version, the app name, your base package, and then any other tools. They have some cool features though, right? You can add features. First of all, that's the Micronaut AOT and the security JWT down there. But you can also preview what the project looks like, right? So you can just look at source code if you want. You can also diff different examples of the project. So I like those features. And then you can, generate it there. And then how you implement a simple hello endpoint with Micronaut. You see there's a number of annotations there, and then 3 annotations on the method. It's just secured, it returns text plain, and it's just grabbing the principal and printing that out. So depending on how you implemented your security mechanism, this should work whether you're doing OAuth or database authentication or whatnot, because it's just Java security principle. And then to configure it with OAuth, since we have that JWT dependency, you can just specify the JWKS URL, which, oh my goodness, that's a long property name, right? Micronaut.security.token.jwt.signatures.jwks.octa.url. Good luck memorizing that. But a JWT is basically 3 parts, right? It's a header, it's claims, and a signature, but it's just a base64 encoded string. So there's nothing really special about decoding it, right? You base64 decode it, and boom, now you can see what's in there. And the header, the biggest problem with it, it has algorithms, right, specified in there. One of the optional algorithms is none. So if you search for how long has there been a JWT exploit with algorithm none, there's a site out there that says 4 days, right? Just like the factory floor says there's been 4 days since someone got hurt or whatnot. So it's one of the problems with JWT, but it works pretty well otherwise. So what I'm going to use today to actually test everything and confirm that you can access this endpoint is a tool called HTTPy. And HTTPy is an alternative to curl, but it's much better because it does application JSON by default. You can see you can do a put very easily, and you just specify name and value, and you can also do status. I'm a teapot, that kind of stuff. So nice little tool. I recommend using it. And so once you've built that app with Micronaut, you can run it with Gradle run, and then you hit the endpoint with HTTPy. You set an access token that you get from somewhere, and then you can access it using that access token. So authorization is the name of the header. If you're even doing basic authentication, right, it looks the same. It's just authorization basic, and then the username, password, base64 encoded. So this is, more secure than that for sure. And then just to prove it all works, I took a screenshot of it on Tuesday, and you can see that's what it looks like. It prints out the date every time. So each time I do this presentation, I have to take new screenshots, or people are like, hey, you haven't updated that in a while. But it all works. And then what it's returning here at the bottom there is the subclaim of the JWT. And so that's just how Auth0 does it. The unique thing about Auth0 is they support social login, right out of the box. You've already configured when you create a new instance with it. And that's the pipe there. Auth0 pipe means that you're using a user from the database that you added on Auth0. If you logged in with Google, it'd say Google-OAuth2. And so you might be wondering, well, what if I have a user with the same email and they use Gmail and they're actually the same person? Well, we have an account linking feature that you can use to link those together. So moving on to Quarkus, you can install it with SDKman as well. SDK install Quarkus, Quarkus create app, and then specify the coordinates and the extensions. You might notice I didn't specify Maven or Gradle when I did the Micronaut app. That's because they default to Gradle. So a couple years ago when I first created this presentation, I used Maven for all of them. And it was because everyone but Micronaut defaulted to Gradle. Well, now since start.spring.io actually defaults to Gradle, there's 2 out of the 4 that default to Gradle. And so I figured I would use Gradle for all the examples. So I like to ask the question because it's different wherever I go. Who prefers Maven? And who prefers Gradle? So right, he's actually doing a talk on Maven tonight at Pittsburgh Java User Group. So I think it was about 50-50. The interesting thing was I did a workshop over at DevOps Belgium at the beginning of the month, and it was 90% Maven folks. And our workshop was all Gradle. And we asked that question at the beginning, then we were like, uh-oh, right? Maybe we need to add Gradle or Maven as an option in the future.
Do you have a feel of the Gradle people, whether it's classic Gradle or Gradle Kotlin?
Classic Gradle or Gradle Kotlin. So if you're using Gradle, how many are using Gradle Kotlin? And how many are using Groovy? It's about half and half. Yeah, I used Gradle Kotlin in this book, and all the Spring Boot stuff is back in. So when I was doing it, this is, I wrote the book probably about a year ago. I had to learn a lot of stuff through trial and error because there wasn't much documentation. So if you're using Gradle Kotlin, I commend you because you probably had to go through some similar things. So if you're looking how to package, a Spring Boot app and an Angular app together using like a front end or a Node plugin, it's in there, right? So I had to figure that out, and I probably have a question on Stack Overflow, and there's an answer from someone on how to do it. But when I first started with Quarkus, I actually used the Maven archetype because I wasn't aware of the Quarkus CLI that you could use. So this is not a memorizable, state, right? There's a lot there. So if you want to use archetype, you can. It should create, the same sort of stuff that the CLI does. And just like Micronaut launch, there's a code.quarkus.io. So if you're more of a visual person, you don't like the command line, you can go here and specify all your coordinates, select your extensions. In this case, we're using REST Easy Reactive and small right JWT. And you might be asking why reactive if we're not doing reactive. And I had the same question. The first time I published a blog post, having all these in there, the Quarkus guys came to me and said, hey, you should be using REST Easy. And I'm like, well, then why do you have the other one, right? And what I've learned is it's because certain app servers won't work with the REST Easy reactive stuff. But if you actually, are just using the built-in app server like they do, it'll work just fine. So they recommend REST Easy Reactive if you can. If you're using WebSphere or whatever, then you probably have bigger things to worry about. So a hello resource or hello endpoint with Quarkus, you might notice that there's a number of Jakarta endpoints. So this is because they're using microprofile. So both Quarkus and Helidon implement microprofile, and a lot of their imports will be the same, and their code even looks similar. Versus Micronaut and Spring Boot have their own way of doing things. So again, a lot of imports there. The only one that's Quarkus specific is the authenticated, and then we're just returning the username again. And so microprofile has a JWT security spec, and in there they have 2 different properties, the issuer and the public key location. And to me, it's a little weird because guess what? You can look up the public key location, which is the JWKS URL from the issuer. So if you were to go to the issuer, and I know it's difficult to see up there, but it's /well-known/OpenID configuration. That'll give you all the endpoints, the scope supported, and all that kind of stuff about the issuer or the identity provider. So I think part of me is like, it's unfortunate that microprofile doesn't do the lookup, but maybe it's for performance reasons. But I have done this talk in front of microprofile folks, and they've come up to me after and been like, maybe we should fix that. But the cool thing about Quarkus is they have an OIDC plugin for OpenID Connect, which also has OAuth built in, and you can just specify an issuer with that. And so you can implement the same thing with a different dependency and only have one property. So to test it with Quarkus, it's very similar. You have Gradle to start it up, and then hit the endpoint, specify the token, and hit it with that bearer token. So here, the nice thing is I never have to update this slide because they don't actually print out dates, right? So hitting the endpoint 401, specifying the token, and then hitting it again with that token, you can see it prints out the username. So Spring Boot was the first that had start.spring.io, but you might not know this, but start.spring.io is also a REST API. So in this example, I can actually hit it with HTTP, and if I hit that starter.tgz, it'll give me a zip file or a TGZ file that I can expand, and then everything's in there. There's also a .zip endpoint, and the only difference I've noticed between the two is if I use this one, I don't have to make like the Gradle W executable. But if I use a zip one, I do. So maybe that's a Windows versus Mac thing or Linux, I don't know. But the dependencies are Spring MVC is the web one, and then the OAuth 2 resource server allows us to implement this OAuth flow, with Spring Security. And then the other ones have native built in, right? So native is the ability to build it with GraalVM. With Spring Boot, you do have to add that as an extra dependency to actually get that feature. And with Spring Boot 2, you had to add a whole lot of stuff. Now it's just one plugin if you're using Maven. It's one plugin if you're using Gradle, and it's not too hard to add. If you forget to add it when you create your app, you can always go on start.spring.io, use their feature of exploring the source code and grab it from there. And then I'm specifying the package name, the name of the project, and the base directory, and expanding it. So Josh Long's second favorite place on earth besides production, right? Start.spring.io, they default to Gradle now. You can also try Gradle Kotlin, which is pretty slick. And then the latest version, you can tell I took the screenshot earlier this week because they updated the version today. There's now a 3.1.5. I'm happy to report that I did update my examples. So when we look at the actual code and the comparison numbers, that is using the latest version 3.1.5. I just forgot to update this screenshot. There's also a CLI. So when Spring Boot first came out in 2014, there was the ability with the Spring Boot CLI to run Spring, I think it was, and then a file like app.groovy, and it would actually start up a Spring Boot app. So the first time they announced like Spring Boot on Twitter was Rob Winch, and it was just a controller class written in Groovy, right? It didn't have any imports or anything like that. And it was like 4 lines of code, and it was a whole functioning like app, right? And so since then, they've removed that ability where you can use the actual Spring CLI to run anything, and you can use it to generate projects. So very similar to what I use with HTTP/IA. And so the number of lines of code to do a REST endpoint in Spring Boot is the least, right? But look at those class names. They went on the long class names thing, right? But Spring is always run. If you have a name like Spring Framework, right, it's going to be tough to shorten that up. So in addition to the OAuth 2 resource server as a dependency, we at Okta have a thing called the Okta Spring Boot Starter. And this is a thin wrapper around Spring Security, because Spring Security has a number of different OAuth things. They have an OAuth 2 resource server, they have an OAuth 2 client, and then there's OAuth 2 login, right? So there's different dependencies for that. We just basically put them all in one, and then we activate certain features based on what your properties are. And also we make the properties so you can actually remember them, right? Okta.OAuth2 issuer is a lot easier to remember than spring.security.oauth2.resourceserver.jwt.issuer-URI, right? I've been doing this for years and I still don't know that whole thing. So pretty slick. And then you can run it with Gradle boot run. You can hit it, same as the other ones. And then the biggest difference is you'll see here, they print out a whole bunch of security headers, right? The other frameworks aren't printing out those security headers by default. But you also have to remember Spring Security started as a CG security way back in like 2005, right? So they've been doing this for almost 18 years now. And so they've learned a lot of things along the way, and the other ones are pretty new, right? Only a few years old. So I do appreciate that they're adding all those security headers in there. I couldn't actually print out the token because it wouldn't fit on the screen. So you can just see the first one, 401, second one's a 200 there. And the last framework we're going to talk about is Helidon. So when I first started using Helidon, I used their Maven archetype to generate everything. Similar to the Quarkus one, just hard to remember, right? There's a lot of stuff there, so difficult to memorize all that. they did last year create a new website, similar to start.spring.io and the others, where you can generate your project that way. There's two flavors of Helidon. There's SE and MP, and it's kind of like Spring MVC Webflux versus Spring MVC, right? SE is their reactive stuff. MP is the micro profile, and otherwise, it's still the same framework. They recently, only in the last month, added their CLI to SDK Man, which I appreciate, because if you're doing Helidon development and you're just using Maven, there's no way to like start your app. So with all the other three, you can start your app, whether it's Gradle boot run for Spring Boot or Quarkus dev for Quarkus. Like there's a way to start your app. With Helidon, you have to package it and run it, and that's kind of right, a little lame. But with the CLI, you can run Helidon dev, and then it'll do the hot reload and allow you to start it. And so you can just init it there, specify the flavor, all that other stuff. And then the hello resource looks similar, right, to Quarkus because they have similar imports. So get the authenticated is from their own security package, and then Java, the principal is not from security, it's from their own, and that's how you do it with Helidon. Now the difference is they require one more file. The rest of the frameworks actually, you have a REST endpoint with one file. Did you have a question?
Oh, from YouTube.
Yeah.
Quarkus also has a reactive implementation, question mark?
So Quarkus REST Easy Reactive is reactive, but only if you use like their, I think it's Uno and like Spring has, but yeah, it's built in there. And so it's in this repo that I will show you as we get into the examples. There's a pull request where I've actually started implementing reactive for the various frameworks. Quarkus was super easy. Spring, you have to change a dependency, but it still works with the Spring MVC code. I think Micronaut I couldn't figure out whether it was reactive or not, but there's no reactive I could find. I think it's just like a flag you turn on. And then Helidon, I haven't implemented yet, but they did point me to where I could do that. But with Helidon, you do have to register that resource, and you do have to specify the login config to turn on microprofile JWT support. So that to me is a little bit more friction than the other ones require, but it is what it is. And you can actually add the JWT dependency when you're creating the app. Like Quarkus, you can. So here you have to go into your pom.xml and add that dependency. And then the properties are the same, right, as you used for Quarkus for microprofile. And then you package it and run it, or you can use helidon.dev if you're using the CLI, hit it with HTTPIE, and then looks the same as the others. Prints out your subject there at the end. So one of the fun things to talk about is startup time. And this is you as a developer, right? And these times are from my kick-ass MacBook Pro M1, right? I do on an M2, but it's tough to justify because this one's plenty fast, right? And it's a lot faster than my Intel-based one. So I probably will ask just because I've had it 2 years. But if you have a chance to get an M1 and you don't have one, get it. And if you can skip to an M2, do it. The biggest reason is, guess what? I can go all day long without plugging in. And I'm using IntelliJ the whole time. I'm doing Zoom the whole time. And the battery basically lasts like 8 to 10 hours, right? And that's how laptops should be, right? And it's cool to have a kick-ass laptop that lasts that long, right? Because my old Intel one, like if I tried to do this presentation without it being plugged in, it would die by the end of it, right? So they've really come a long way with the battery life. So if you look at Micronaut, we're just doing, Gradle and running it. That's the dev start up there, 400 milliseconds. Quarkus takes a lot longer, 1400 milliseconds, so 1.4 seconds, which you're probably not going to notice. The difference is what Quarkus does is it monitors all your files. So Java files, properties files, whatever. If you change any of them, it restarts. So you will only have to endure those 1.4 seconds like once during your day. And it's got the ability while you're running Quarkus dev to like press certain commands to start doing debugging, to pop a UI and look at the components and things like that. So as far as developer experience goes, that's the best one I found. With Spring Boot, they have Spring Boot dev tools, but you have to compile a class. And so Eclipse users, you save a class, it compiles, right? IntelliJ doesn't work by default that way. So it's a little friction there. We actually have to compile something. So Quarkus just doesn't care if you compile, it'll compile it for you. So I really like that experience. And then, running them as Java-jar. If you're running on the JVM, Quarkus and Micronaut, very similar times. Spring Boot takes a little longer. And then Helidon, kind of similar to Spring Boot there.
What is the package startup doing on Spring Boot and Helidon with the dev one?
It's just doing Java-jar.
Repeat the question.
Right, but where does the extra time come from?
So the question is, what's the startup time doing package versus dev? Dev is just me running like Gradle boot run, right? And the package is I've packaged it, and then I'm running Java-jar.
And try again. On Spring Boot and Helidon, the package startup is longer than the dev startup.
Yes.
That seems backwards, so I'm not understanding why, because it's already compiled and built and you're just starting it, whereas Raible and Maven presumably have more to do.
I agree with you. I'm just telling you the times that I got when I did this stuff. So she said that it's weird that Spring Boot and Helidon actually start slower when you're doing Java-jar than when you're doing boot run or Helidon dev. And I agree with that. It should be. But if you look at Micronaut, it is a little slower, right? So it's kind of consistent. Quarkus is just the one that takes a lot more time when you're doing Quarkus dev.
It could be possible that it is like aggressively loading stuff in advance so that like runtime performance is better or things.
Right. So the comment was runtime performance might be better. You're saying with the Java-jar?
I mean, like with the Spring Boot, the production mode versus dev mode, the production mode is already eagerly loading everything at the start itself rather than when the request comes in.
It's possible, but there's no request happening here. It's just starting it up, right? So,
when you do dev startup, you should Gradle has a Gradle daemon. Gradle daemon, it can start it or it's not. So that's something like it's a cold start, a real cold start versus package. So faster.
That's a good point. We're using in the Spring Boot version, we're using Gradle, and so there's a Gradle daemon. So chances are maybe I didn't, reboot my computer beforehand, so there's no daemon running, or maybe it was running, right? And that's why the startup is faster that way. Good point. So you might be wondering, what about GraphQL APIs, right? We've been talking about REST APIs. Well, why GraphQL is the first question, right? How many people have used GraphQL or implemented it? So it's one of those things that you can see from the room, right? A bunch of hands went up. It's very popular, and it was invented by Facebook. And part of the reason is because at Facebook they wanted to have one API and many different clients, right? A web client, a mobile client, all these different clients. And so when I worked at LinkedIn back in 2008, one of the things I noticed about our REST APIs is by default we'd return a shallow response, and if you wanted more data, then you would hit a different endpoint, and you might tack on parameters to get more data. And so we had to implement two different versions of the same API, basically. And what GraphQL allows you to do is the client can specify what it wants. So on the server side, it's very much more simple to implement, and then the client kind of takes on the burden of asking for what it needs. And so I think from a client development perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And then you might be asking, does your favorite framework support GraphQL? And if your favorite framework's not in this list, I'm sorry, but it is a Java meetup, and these are the popular ones. So Micronaut does have support, and Quarkus does have support, small I GraphQL. Spring Boot actually had multiple projects that implemented GraphQL as like Spring Boot starters, and only in the last year, I think it was last October around this time, they took one of the most popular ones and made it an official Spring Boot project. So now it's GraphQL for Spring, I think is the name of it. It's not specific to Spring Boot, but it is supported starter, officially supported by Spring. And then Helidon does have support, and there's a link to it there. So I've only tried the Spring Boot ones, but I imagine a lot of times it's pretty simple, right? If you're using JPA or you're doing any sort of backend persistence, they have ways of mapping that to GraphQL, and it's usually just setting it up on the server and then adding entities to it. And really a lot of the work comes in when you're implementing the client. So I showed you how you can secure these frameworks or the REST endpoints with OAuth, but you might be wondering about OAuth. So trying to understand OAuth is very difficult, and a lot of it is because of all the different specs, right, that you might be interested in, and it's kind of like a maze that's really hard to get out of. So this is a blog post from my colleague, Aaron Parecki, who works on the OAuth specs and has for the last decade. He basically is calling for OAuth 2.1. And OAuth 2.1 is basically taking the best practices in OAuth and kind of, you know, standardizing them. So Pixie proof key for code exchange is required if you're doing SPA apps or you're doing mobile apps. Redirect URIs can't have asterisks in them. They can't be wildcards. They have to be specific. Implicit grant is omitted. Resource owner password credentials grant is omitted, and some other stuff. And you know, the implicit grant was originally invented so you can do browser-based authentication with OAuth in your actual, you know, browser, and the access token would be returned in the browser URL. So that's not good because that could end up in server logs, right? And then the resource owner password grant actually allows you to send a username and password to the authorization server. So what's the difference between doing username and password? You know, OAuth is to get rid of username and password. So the fact that they have that in there is kind of weird. They say it was originally for like legacy clients. So think of Windows 3.1 for some reason, right? And it can't pop a browser because it didn't even have a browser, right? But it can send, you know, something to the endpoint, that username and password. So we're calling for those to be removed. But in reality, like if there's an identity provider, I don't know that they're just going to implement OAuth 2.1 and discard these things, because they might have customers who are like, we want to be less secure and use resource owner password grant, right? And they'll let them, right? You pay me money, we'll let you have that feature. So that's what I would like to see, is you have to actually pay to be less secure. That would be fun. So I mentioned OAuth and authenticating, but really there's nothing in the OAuth spec about authentication. It's an authorization framework that allows an app to get your data on its behalf, right? So it's like, let's say LinkedIn, right? And you want to allow LinkedIn to pull in your tweets or for some reason, right? Like integrate the two. Well, back in the day, you might actually enter your Gmail username and password, and then it would go and get your contacts and invite people to LinkedIn, right? Well, with OAuth, you just basically, you know, log in with Gmail, and then it gives it an access token and it accesses your contacts on your behalf. So it's for delegated authorization, but there's nothing in an access token, or there shouldn't be in most cases, anything about the person's identity. And so what happened when it was first implemented by like Facebook and Google was they had like a /me endpoint. And you could use the access token to get the user's information from that. And they decided it'd be a good idea to standardize that and make it into OpenID Connect. So OpenID Connect uses the same flows as OAuth, but it returns an access token and an ID token. And that ID token might have the user's information, their phone number, their address, and even, you know, their roles or something like that. So you can add those as claims to your access token. And there's a few that the spec says that's okay, but if you get really fat access tokens, you're kind of doing it wrong, because you can always use that access token to talk to the user info endpoint and get more information about the user. So all of these frameworks support not only OAuth, but you've seen that most of them call it JWT. They don't call it OAuth, right? But with OpenID Connect, they do call it OpenID Connect. Or there's OAuth 2 for Micronaut, and they call it OAuth 2 with Spring Boot, but it's really OpenID Connect. And I haven't had any luck getting it to work with Helidon. Even though I've been talking to the people that implemented it, I haven't actually made it work. So I probably need to revisit that soon. So you might be asking about testing. No one writes tests, right? You don't need to test your apps. Well, it's a good idea, right? And so one of the cool things that Quarkus has is when it comes to native development, I think Spring Boot might have something similar now. You can just extend an existing test and annotate it with Quarkus integration test, and it'll create a native version of that test. And the reason that is important is because even though you create a jar and everything works, when you compile with GraalVM to native, sometimes there's things like the HTTPS extension that hasn't been added to your build process. And so when you actually try to make a request out from that application in native mode, it won't work, right? So it's good to have a test, right, to verify that functionality is there. And if you're testing security with Spring Security, it has excellent support for any type of testing, particularly OAuth, because it allows you to mock out the JWT, allows you to mock out users and roles, and you basically just add an annotation, and then it sets up the context for you, and you don't have to worry about, you know, the authentication process. And so now we move on to Docker and building, you know, a Java app with Docker. Well, the cool thing is you only need 5 lines, right? You can create a Docker file for any of these frameworks. Whether it's in the build directory or the target directory will depend on your build tool, right? Gradle or Maven. And if you're doing jar-based development, then this will work for any of them. People don't like maintaining Docker files, so there's another alternative. But just to continue with this, if you do have a Docker file, you can do Docker build, give it a tag, and then you can run it, and boom, you have a Docker image. But there's another tool that we use in the JHipster project, and it's very popular from Google. It's called Jib, and I like to say get jibby with it, because it allows you to actually read your POM file or your build.gradle, and then it creates the Docker image based on that. So it knows where the jar is, right? It doesn't care if it's in the build or the target directory, figures all that out for you, and you can just run mvn jib build or gradle jib, and it'll build that Docker image for you. Or you can build it directly to your Docker daemon. So that would be running locally, and then if you want to push it to Docker Hub, you would have to do that with the Docker push command. And so Micronaut uses Jib, or allows you to use Jib, but you must configure plugins for it. Quarkus generates 4 Docker-related files, and then Quarkus does allow you to add Jib as well. And then Spring Boot 2.3 has built-in support for building in Docker. So first of all, that first one is with Maven. You can see the Gradle command is a little shorter. Maybe that's why they decided to default to Gradle, right? They just like shorter commands. But it uses layered jars for faster builds, and this is kind of catching on with all the various frameworks. Is dependencies, right? Hardly ever change. Snapshot dependencies change a little more. Resources, those are like your application.properties files and stuff, and the application changes the most. So that allows your Docker builds to happen faster. But what I've noticed, especially on this M1, is if I use like the GraalVM native, Java thing and actually compile it locally, it takes like a minute. If I do it with Docker, it takes like 3 or 4 minutes. So, you're probably not going to want to do the Docker builds all the time, all day long, when you can just do it much faster with GraalVM. And when it comes to Helidon, they have 3 Docker-related files. They're the only ones that have JLink support out of the box. JLink allows you to really condense the parts of the JVM that you're using and actually put it into the container. And then Helidon doesn't have support for Jib, as far as I can tell. So if you want to go native with these frameworks with GraalVM, with Micronaut CLI, you just create the app, and then you can package it with MVM package and specify packaging as native image, or you can use the Docker commands. And the difference is the native image just builds a local, executable that you can run. The Docker build native uses Docker for it. So if you, for some reason, can install GraalVM on your local machine, that's where you might want to use Docker to do the build for you. But the cool thing is it's also in a Docker image when you're done, right? Which is probably good for production. And what I noticed today is I actually tried to take all of the native versions of these, put them in Docker to see how fast they would start up on a cloud instance server, and then run and see how long it takes to respond to the first request. And what I found in Micronaut's documentation is actually a script called TTFR, which is time to first response, right? Or time to first request or something like that. But I appreciate them putting that out there, because I spent like an hour trying to write the script, and then I found it and there's worked. And after an hour, I still couldn't get mine to work. So if you want to do Quarkus, it actually has it built in as well. So the difference between, Quarkus, Micronaut, and Helidon and Spring Boot is Spring Boot is the only one that allows, or it makes you add like this native plugin, right? The others kind of have it by default. But you use either of those commands to build the native image. And then you can also build it with Docker and then run it with Docker. And for Spring, I just use start.spring.io if I haven't actually added the plugin, because it's just that first one, that native Maven plugin if you're using Maven. And if you're using Gradle, it's pretty easy, right? It's just a one-liner, so not too difficult. And then once you have those, you can build the executable locally, or you can build it in a Docker container. And then for Helidon, since they don't have, Jib, you have to use Docker to build it and run it. So any questions before we get into like performance numbers? Because the code part of it's over. All right. So native startup performance. This has been the test that I've been doing for the last couple of years. So if you go on my speaker deck and look, back through the years, you'll see different numbers on this graph. And it's important to note that I am testing on an M1, right? A really fast machine. You're not going to put M1s into production. You're not going to pay that much, right? You're going to use cheap Linux images that are probably virtualized on EC2 or something like that. So this isn't that accurate, but it's fun. And I like to use it because it allowed me to identify in August that Quarkus was taking 36 seconds instead of the normal 25 or so, right? And at one point, Quarkus was faster than Micronaut. So it's funny when the times go up, typically the framework authors blame GraalVM. And if you enter an issue, GraalVM guys will come and blame the framework authors. So there's actually an issue out there. You see Helidon 322 with the star. The reason the star is on there is because Helidon doesn't work with Java 21, which is funny because Java, GraalVM, and Helidon are all Oracle projects. So to me, they couldn't get their shit together. Sorry. But you know, Micronaut, Spring Boot, and Quarkus are obviously investing more time into making it work with Java 21. So all of theirs work just fine. So these numbers are from Helidon, where I had to compile it with Java 20. So I was able to build it with Java 21, but when you run it, you get a stack trace, and with Java 20, you don't. So you can see Micronaut starts up the fastest, right? 415, that was released this week. So when I did this presentation on Tuesday, I was using 414. The times did go down. The funny thing is the Micronaut guys did contribute a PR to this repository for the optimized version that does more ahead of time compiling. Why is it slower, right? When I first did this, it was actually faster, right? They optimized it and it trimmed a few milliseconds off. It's weird that it's slower now. But Quarkus, like I said, used to be down in the 18 millisecond range. Now it's up to 27. Maybe they have more features or telemetry or something like that in there. I'm not sure. But Spring Boot 315, you can see it starts in 40 milliseconds. Helidon's 50. And then the Helidon optimized version was also from contributors from outside. It was from the Helidon team. And what they did is they removed Open API. So by default, you create, you know, a Helidon app with the commands I showed you. It adds Open API in there. So it's funny to me because, right, I try to create the bare bones example because I feel like GraalVM should be used in a serverless environment. And, you know, maybe you shouldn't have Open API in there by default if you're trying to be fast and start up quick, because if they didn't have Open API in there, it'd be beating Spring Boot, right? And they do, so it's a little slower. But one of the suggestions that the Quarkus folks gave me, so I was on the Quarkus Insights podcast in August before I did this presentation, and didn't have the new version of Quarkus out, right? So everything was pretty even. They were, you know, Micronaut 4 was faster than Micronaut 3, so all of a sudden they lost the top spot. But they gave me a great suggestion. They were like, you know, you're just taking what the framework prints, right? So you start up Micronaut, it prints started in 21 milliseconds, right? You start up Spring Boot, it says, you know, 0.59 milliseconds or whatever. And they were like, you should actually test how long it takes for it to respond, right? Write a script that starts it and then pings it until it responds, because that's a better time. So someone's lying, right? Look at this one. These are what it prints. This is reality. So I love the suggestion, right? Because it really shows that they're pretty even, right? I mean, Spring Boot takes a little longer, but the rest of them are, you know, milliseconds apart. I think it's funny that Micronaut optimized is still slower than the non-optimized version. But this shows it's much more even than the previous one shows. And I tweeted this out on Tuesday after my presentation in Philly, and the Micronaut folks, they retweeted this one, right? Not this one. But that to me does say that someone's like, I don't think they're doing any math or whatever, right? But the math is kind of off from reality. And I think an even better test would be they're deployed somewhere that's serverless, right? And it's actually, it starts, you know, because what I'm doing is I'm starting it with this script and then I'm pinging 8080 until it responds, but that's eating up resources on my local machine, right? So the better thing would have it deployed, right? And then it has to start and see how long it takes then. So I do appreciate the Micronaut folks, you know, encouraging me to do this. So, and I'm on MacBook Pro from 2021, M1 Max. But also the other thing the Quarkus folks asked me to do was test it in the cloud, right? They're like, you're running on an M1. That's silly. No one's going to put M1s in production, right? Test on a real instance. And so to me, that was like maybe you have one virtual CPU and 2 gigs of RAM, right? You could probably even go smaller and do a T2 micro, which is one CPU and a half a gig of RAM. But the problem that I had was I didn't have these images available so I could just download them and run it, right? And so what I had to do is actually install GraalVM on the instance in EC2 and build them so I could run them. So T2 small doesn't even build, right? None of the projects build. There's not enough memory. T2 medium, which is 4 gigs of RAM. Micronaut actually builds, but Quarkus and Spring Boot failed to build. And so if you want to see why, there's links, right, that you can go. I put it on gist.github.com what the failures are. But then I tried T2 large with 8 gigs of RAM, and they all compile. So that's what I ended up doing the next test on. So this was using that script, and this is actually, you know, similar to what I get on my M1, but you can see here, Micronaut is a little slower than Quarkus, but we're talking 4 milliseconds, right? The human eye can't see that fast, so it's good we scripted it to see that. But then Spring Boot, quite a bit slower, right? As far as this is concerned, it almost takes, you know, a second. And so when Spring Boot 2 was out and I was doing these kind of things, it was even more slow. And so they refactored Framework 6 and Spring Boot 3 to be more GraalVM and native friendly, right? And I totally thought they would be able to refactor it all the way to be as fast as Quarkus and Micronaut. This proves they didn't, right? So part of me is a little disappointed, but I didn't do the work, so how can I be disappointed, right? They did a really good job. They just, you know, couldn't quite compete with these because these had the late, you know, starter advantage because Spring Boot's been around for, you know, almost 10 years and they've only been around for a few. And so the native memory is another thing that I think is important to test just because, you know, a lot of times Java apps might take a half a gig or even a gig of memory. And so if you're going to do serverless, you're probably trying to save money, right? And you want less memory usage. So you can see here that Quarkus uses the least amount of memory. And the interesting thing that I found with Helidon, and I entered an issue for it, is that it increases on every request. And so the theory there is they might increase to a certain point, right? And then they stop increasing it. But it's interesting that the other ones don't really increase that much. And so what I've done as a test and what I have that I'll show you in a demo is it starts up, it grabs the memory usage, and then makes 1 request, grabs the memory usage, then it makes 4 more requests, so 5 total, and then it prints out the results. And over the years, I've found bugs with Micronaut and with Helidon that you send 1 more request, it bumps the memory up 10 megs, right? And you're like, that seems weird. So with Micronaut, it was like a neti setting. You know, you allocated the threads to 3 or something like that, like you tone it down a bit or whatever. But to me, that was like, have they tested this stuff? Right? Like they should know that it's increasing memory on every request, right? And so that's kind of the fun part of doing this presentation is I find weird things like Helidon doesn't support Java 21, right? That was the one for this week. But still much more performant than a regular Java-jar app, or much less memory used. And then if I do it on EC2, right, you can see about 70, but Quarkus is still the least used. So uses less memory on my Mac, a little more memory on EC2. But that's the other thing I've noticed is it uses more memory versus like an Intel if I run this on my Intel MacBook Pro. But the startup time is faster on the M1. So there's little trade-offs like that. So now I have a demo, and this is a GitHub repo. So octadev/auth0-java rest-api-examples. And since we're already mirrored, I shouldn't have to mirror. See if I can get out of Zoom here, though. Okay, we're still good, but it's a little small, so let me bump the resolution here. Okay, a little bit better. Close my email.
No, we're not.
You need more?
No, I'm just wondering, are you?
Oh,
you have
the
2 screens going? 2 different?
I didn't change anything, but we can stop sharing and reshare.
No, that's not it. It's are you mirroring your screen? Is what you see on your screen the same as what's up on the?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yep. And so if we go into this project, I'll just bump the fonts in in the little command window here once it starts up. So CD, I have it OS 0.
And do share your screen.
It is screen shared, right?
Yep.
Yep. OS 0 Java REST API examples. So you can see there's no smoke and mirrors here, or git remote -b. You can see that's where it is. And this Daniel Keck guy is the one from Helidon who created a PR to optimize Helidon. So there's a PR out there for it. I just downloaded it to test it. And then we'll clear this and we'll make this a bit bigger. And then bump the fonts there. And I'll open this up in IntelliJ just to show you. There's a demo script that I created that shows you how to create all these from scratch. So if you somehow think that maybe what I have in this repo doesn't match what would work if you, or be created if you create it from scratch, then you can go through this demo script. So right up here at the top, I can open it up in the browser so it's a little easier to read. It's written in ASCII Doctor. And things probably will be a little slower because I'm using Zoom, right? And what I've noticed is that does tend to slow things down a bit, but this is just the steps, right? You install JDK with GraalVM, you generate an access token, then you create all the APIs, right? Just like my slide showed you how to do. There's nothing special in there. And then there's a startup time comparison where you run, I ran each image 3 times before recording the numbers, then I ran it 5 times and then wrote them all down. So these are all the commands to start them. And then the memory usage comparison. So you can see, you know, after startup, after 1 request, and after 5 requests. So you can see Helidon keeps climbing there, and the others kind of, you know, are more even after the 1 versus 4. And then if you wanted to, you know, clone the repo and try it all yourself, you can build it with build sh. You can start any of them, and you can test the memory of any of them, passing in an access token. So that's what I'll show you here. So the first thing we can do is start. I've already built them back in my hotel room. We could start Micronaut. You can see there, duration to start, 418 seconds. Or milliseconds, right? So 4 seconds, but it's weird because sometimes it's 40 milliseconds. Sometimes it's 400, but usually 400 only happens on the first time. That's why I do the 3 times, right? So we're getting 43, 45, 43, 47, 40. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty consistent. And if we do Quarkus, oh, cannot execute binary file. What happened? I mean, there's always got to be a demo failure, right? So let's see. We can cat the build command here, and I can rebuild Quarkus just to make sure. Usually takes a minute. In the meantime, it'll probably slow down the other ones, but we'll try it anyway. We'll go into Spring Boot here. Actually, it's at the root directory, so cancel that. Oh, it doesn't even know what my prompt is. Oh, better close that one. Open a new one. See, this is Zoom slowing things down because usually it's like snappy, right?
Blame the screen. Go ahead.
It's your fault. Bump the fonts a little, start Spring Boot. 555 milliseconds. Oops. Sorry, I didn't mean to do that. 90 milliseconds. 103, 66, 66, 182. Kind of all over the place, right? So I don't think this would happen in production, but doing it on like the EC2 thing did change. And I think what we've talked to like the Quarkus folks about is a lot of times the variance is because I have other stuff running, right? Most cases I can have nothing running. I'm in my hotel room. I just have, you know, maybe IntelliJ and maybe a terminal, and that's it because I'm, you know, recording the numbers. But when you get Zoom involved and stuff like that, it does change it a bit. But, you know, 56 is probably the best we're going to get with Spring Boot. There's 61, 56 again. And then if we try Helidon, says over 1 second, but the reason is because if we go into Helidon target and LL, you'll see I'm pointing to a Helidon 20 optimized version. So I got to remove that and restore the Helidon back that I created, and then CD, and then start Helidon. and then you get the stack trace, right? Because even though it compiled with Java 21 and GraalVM, it doesn't actually run. So the thing I love about this is I entered an issue in the Helidon project, and one person, from the Helidon blamed GraalVM because they don't have backwards compatibility. And then there's a comment from a GraalVM guy being like, it's actually your fault, right? And so to be fair, what the Helidon folks are doing is concentrating mostly on Helidon 4, which has virtual thread support. And they say that once that's out, and it should be very soon, it will have Java 21 support. And then they will also add Java 21 support to, Helidon 3.2.2 or the 3 channel. But if you're using Java and not using GraalVM, like Helidon works just fine with Java 21, right? I was able to start it, run it, all that. It's just when you get into the GraalVM stuff. And so we'll exit out of this one, and you can see Quarkus was able to build in 1 minute, 25 seconds. So let's start it again, see what we get with Quarkus. Looks like 965 milliseconds. It's a little long, 56 milliseconds, 48, 53. And the warning it's giving me is it's a native app, right? But I'm killing it in the script, so that's why it goes away. But yeah, Micronaut was around the 40 milliseconds, right? Quarkus is high 40s, and then Spring Boot's like 60, 70, and Helidon's, doesn't work, right? At least with GraalVM 21. So that's that part, and then let's look at the memory, right? So I'll create an access token. Oscillator CLI allows you to do that. So I can just say test token and then pass in an audience. And that's what I've configured all of these to expect is the same audience. And then it'll create an access token for me. So I can grab this whole string. Hopefully it's not cutting it off somewhere. I can set token equals. Cancel that. What is that? And then clear it. And then I can do memory for Micronaut. So token and then Micronaut. So you can see 53, 62, 64. Right, and that's 67. So it's pretty consistent. We can do the same for Quarkus. 41, which is less when it first starts, right? 52, 54. So it doesn't increase much, and that's pretty consistent. So it uses the least amount of memory. And then if we do Spring Boot, it's 84 after 5 requests, 83 after 1 request, 84 again. So it's pretty consistent. And then Helidon, stack trace, right? So I just like showing the stack trace. So if you wanted to, go out to this repo, it's at github.com. There it is, the API examples. One thing I started because I think it should be possible to actually, run all these on a T2 micro or T2 small is trying to figure out how to package them in a Docker container. And so I was furiously before this trying to make it all work. So I'm writing down some commands, right? And, here's how you do the Micronaut one. It creates an app latest as it's tagged. So you have to tag it to deploy it to Docker Hub. And then I was able to push it. And then this is how to install Docker on an EC2 instance. And then I run into this issue, right? And it's because I'm building on like an ARM device, right? And it's x86 or whatever in the cloud. And so what I did was I created an ARM instance on Linux ARM, right? In EC2, and it still didn't work. So I was like, there's obviously more to do here. But I think that would be a good test because in production, you're probably not just gonna have an executable you run, right? It's probably gonna be more like a Docker container or something like that. So the next time I do this presentation, hopefully I'll have that work. And now we get into community numbers. So the interesting thing about this is many of these are just pretty graphs, right? And they should be taken with a grain of salt. But let me tell you a story. When I first started doing this like comparison of frameworks, it was way back in 2004. It was the first time I ever spoke at a conference, ApacheCon, Las Vegas. And it was comparing like struts and Wicket and Spring MVC was probably around at the time. I don't think JSF was out yet, but comparing the popular Java web frameworks, right? And struts was by far and away the most popular based on mailing list traffic, right? It just made all the others look silly. And so the Wicket guys were basically like, so most people have problems with struts, right? It gets the most questions. And I was like, could be. I'm doing the talk 2 years later. I'm over in Amsterdam, and a lot of the Wiki contributors, right, live in Amsterdam. And by that time, theirs was the most popular. So I was like, do you still believe that mailing list traffic means that you have the most issues? And they're like, no, it's a sign of community. And so I do believe things like Stack Overflow tags are a sign of community, right? Because when I first started working at Okta, for instance, I would be in a room like this and I'd ask how many people had heard of Okta, and like 1 or 2 hands would go up, right? Now, if I'm at a conference, like a lot of times, most hands go up, right? And if you look on Stack Overflow back then, no one was asking questions about us, right? You look now, there's many more. So I do think it's a worthwhile indicator. So here's the Stack Overflow tags. But one of the things I didn't mention from the last slide in my speaker notes is when any of these were released. So you got to take this into mind. Spring Boot 1.0, April 1st, bold move, right? April Fool's Day, 2014. Long time ago, right? And the interesting thing is Martin Fowler's article on microservices came out March 25th, 2014. So both of those were in a week of each other. And then I don't know if you know this, but Spring Cloud was a year later. And so microservices was possible with Spring, like before MicroProfile, right, was kind of out and all that. So they were definitely a forefront leader in that space. So Spring Boot 1.0, April 1st, 2014. The next one was Micronaut 1.0, not until October 23rd, 2018. So that's 5 years ago now. And then Helidon was next, February 14th, 2019. And then Quarkus 1.0 wasn't until November 25th, 2019. So all of this is to explain that Spring Boot had a 5-year head start, right? So there's a reason why they have so many more Stack Overflow tags, for instance. Let me see if I can move this there. And Helidon, whew, they're hurting, right? And in fact, one of the things I like to do is see the difference between Stack Overflow tags, like since the last time I did the presentation. So the last time I did it was August 18th, I think. And Helidon has gone up 4. There's been 4 questions since August, right? So the others have gone up quite a bit. GitHub stars, right? I think this is a worthwhile indicator because chances are only developers are starring it, right? Probably it's not product managers or people outside of development actually starring them, but Spring Boot has got the most. Micronaut and Quarkus, like those are respectable. If I had an open source project myself, I would be proud of that many stars. But Helidon's lagging there. But the interesting thing about Helidon was when I did it in August, I'd probably done it a few months before, but it jumped like 1,000. And so to me, that was like Oracle's getting ready for its big conference. And it was like, hey, employees, go start this project, right? It's part of your job. But the GitHub star growth is interesting. So this is start-history.t9t.io. So you could go use it and look at star growth on other projects. But the momentum is still in Spring Boot's favor, right? Even though the others have been around for a while, like people are still starring Spring Boot, faster than the other ones. Jobs on Indeed, this might be interesting, right? Who's hiring, right? Micronaut, not a skill that a lot of people are hiring for. Quarkus either, or Helidon, right? There's only 15 jobs in the whole US. So there's not a lot of frameworks for companies outside of Oracle that are using it, in my opinion, but holy cow, Spring Boot, right? If you're gonna learn something and you wanna get a job, invest in that. Interestingly enough, so I do this, periodically. I did it in Germany, and those numbers for the other frameworks are much higher. Not like all the way at Spring Boot, but in the hundreds instead of in the 10. So that could be like Europe's recovering faster than we are. Maybe it could be that. But if you search for MicroProfile as a job thing, 0. No one's hiring just for MicroProfile, right? Like these frameworks are more popular than that. Java itself, 42,000 jobs. JavaScript, 36,000. So we've got to beat, right? And Kotlin's at 1,600. So not a lot of hiring for that, but more than the frameworks, right? Twitter followers, Spring Boot's got the most. Micronaut and Quarkus, very respectable. Helidon, kind of respectable too, but how much have they gone up since August? So the first one was Micronaut up 100, Quarkus up 300, Spring Boot up 800, and Helidon up 64, right? So once you get momentum, right, it actually helps you. Frank, 5 minutes left. I didn't know I was timed, but hey, I think I'm on time. So JHipster support, right? I work on the JHipster project. Spring Boot 3 is in JHipster 8.0 RC1, which came out last weekend. We might do a RC or a release this weekend. We have a Micronaut blueprint that has, we'll have Micronaut 4 support probably in a month or so, Quarkus as well. And I wrote a blog post on how to use JHipster with just regular React and Spring Boot and Auth0. And my thoughts are Quarkus provides the best developer joy because you only have to start it once and allows you to do so much from the console. And the memory usage is really low, which I think is important if you're doing serverless and you're using GraalVM. Micronaut is consistently competitive and 4.0 starts the fastest. So the last version, like 6 months ago, 3.0 was slower than Quarkus, but now they've caught up and they've surpassed them. When I first started doing this a couple years ago, they were the fastest. So there was a time there where Quarkus started beating them. Spring Boot has the strongest community ecosystem and growth. They're still growing faster than the others. Helidon has a lot of catching up to do, and Spring Boot 3, not as fast as I expected, at least from a GraalVM perspective. So my action for you is if you're new to Java, try Spring Boot. If you know Spring and you're looking for this better performance, if 50 milliseconds is a big difference for you, then a lot of both Micronaut and Quarkus have like migration paths. And in some instances, they actually have annotations that mirror the Spring annotations. They're just for Quarkus. And both Spring Boot and Quarkus have virtual thread support. With Quarkus, you add an annotation. With Spring Boot, you add a property. So that's pretty cool. If you're using Java 21, you can use virtual threads with them. Testing is important. Invest early and often. Try to keep security in mind, right? I think testing 10 years ago wasn't that important, but now we know it is. And I think security is very similar. And use OpenID Connect and OAuth 2.1 if you can. My team is at developer.auth0.com if you want to use Auth0, if you want to use Okta for your workforce or for your partners. That's all our documentation there. Our handle is OktaDev, and that's on GitHub, YouTube, and Twitter. And we just got 50,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, so we're doing pretty good there. And my call to action for you is subscribe to our Zero Index newsletter because I get credit for it. And Deepu, my colleague over in Europe, does too. So you can unsubscribe next week if you want. But if you subscribe, then people will be like, wow, Matt did pretty good this week. He got a bunch of new subscribers, right? So yeah, the URL there, a0.2/nl-signup/Java. And all the source code is on GitHub. You can see it there. May the auth be with you. Yeah. So this presentation is already up on Speaker Deck there. I uploaded it earlier. So if you want to download it for any reason, it's there. And all my code's on GitHub these days. Thank you. Welcome. Any questions? Because I do have some swag here still.
Problem when people try to build images from Mac or Gradle, they can build multi-platform. So I feel better to build in Docker. Inside Docker, you can create for ARM and for Helidon.
Right, and you noticed here, I even built a Docker image here and it still didn't work on Linux, right? So there's still little issues there. And JHipster has a native plugin, and we've actually done GitHub Actions to create like the actual executables that you can download for the different platforms. Oh my God, so painful, right? Like JHipster kind of creates a bigger example than this, right? Than the one I created, but it would take like 45 minutes on Windows to build the Windows one. Right, and this is like your starter JHipster app. It's not even with any, more features in it. So it was pretty painful in GitHub Actions. But what I've learned since then is if you pay for GitHub Actions or you actually have it built on your machine, you can get a lot faster speeds, right? And I think that's almost like a technique that they use. They're like, well, 45 minutes, but you want to get that down to 5, like pay us some money, we can do it.
You can just start instance or just for building them.
Right, but it is a thing, right? And it shows that Java is very powerful. So maybe you should just use Java because it'll work anywhere instead of Docker images that might not work or native executables that won't work on different platforms. It's a great point, though. Yes.
So apart from the lead time for Spring Boot, what do you think are other factors that are impacting the website? see that Quarkus is much better, there was support, faster staff and everything. It's not catching up as fast as it should, considering all this metrics.
So the question is, why isn't Spring Boot catching Quarkus faster? Oh, why isn't Quarkus as popular as Spring Boot? I think it's one of those things that's momentum, right? Like if you have a lot of followers on a particular platform, like you're going to get way more likes for the same post as someone that doesn't have as many, right? So I think for them, because they are so popular, like people want to learn it, right? And especially outside of the US, I think in very many parts of the world, people are motivated to learn stuff, not because they're curious, but because they want a job, right? And so when you look at the jobs, like, why would you bother learning Quarkus? There's only 45 jobs available, right? Versus thousands of Spring Boot jobs. So I think that could be part of it. Also, just Spring has done an excellent job of backwards compatibility, right? So if you find a tutorial from 2015, chances are it still works, right? And Quarkus and Micronaut haven't really broken backwards compatibility, but they haven't been around long enough to really worry about it, right? But I think like the interesting thing about Micronaut is it has committers that work for Oracle. Like Oracle hired committers from the Micronaut project. And so even though they have Helidon, I think internally they're almost competing between each other, right? And Oracle's big enough that probably Helidon and Micronaut are used in thousands of applications, and that popularity isn't represented in these kind of graphs, right? So that's my only feeling. But I love Spring Boot, right? And I love the ecosystem. So you know, as someone that's going to educate people about it, chances are I'm going to use Spring Boot all the time, because if I publish a blog post about Spring Boot, I get 1,000 hits. If I do a Quarkus one, I get 100, right? So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, you know? Did you guys want some swag? You got some last night? You ready for some more? I got dongles and books. That's it.
I wanted swag.
You want swag?
Mainly for the swag.
Hold on, let me get this guy first. Did you want one of these? I got an Angular mini book and a little USB dongle. All right. You want me to throw it to you? I'll just set it up here. You can come grab it. All right.
I had a question.
All right.
Okay. Besides Spring Boot, which framework has the best ecosystem of other compatible projects?
So this is like, the question is, besides Spring Boot, which other framework has the biggest ecosystem or extensions, right?
Yeah.
Most compatible projects. So Quarkus, I think, just because when Micronaut first started, it was started by a company called OCI, and they were doing a lot of the Gradle stuff as well. And I think it kind of slowed down the project when a lot of the main committers left and went to Oracle, right? And Quarkus has always been a Red Hat project, and it always seems to be better supported that way. Whereas Micronaut's not really an official like Oracle project, and it's not really OCI. So I just think Quarkus, and it's given me the best joy, right? But it goes back and forth every time I do an update of this presentation, where startup times are different, but Quarkus is like doing more, right? They have like a Quarkus Insights video podcast every Monday. And so they're really, and they have a newsletter, and I don't know that Micronaut's doing that same sort of outreach.
Can also use,
They're gonna prize.
Yeah, would you like a book or a dongle?
and Quarkus allowed to use starter.
Oh, really? He said Quarkus use Spring Boot starter, so that's quite the ecosystem, right?
So Helidon.
Netty with Nema or something like that. They're doing their own kind of web server. Question is, will it be faster than the rest? Like, will it be a breakthrough? From what I've seen, based on the Spring Boot stuff, no, right? Because Spring Boot was supposed to be a lot faster with optimizations, and it couldn't catch them. So I don't know that, you would hope Oracle has the Java knowledge to do it, but they can't even make it work on Java 21 like a month after the actual Java 21 came out. So my guess is no, but you also saw the optimized version of Helidon was very close to the other ones, right? So I would expect it maybe gets better, but they also don't have Gradle support, right? So there's these things that the other ones kind of do for the community more, that they're a little more not community oriented, it seems. But I do believe they're getting a lot of usage internally. It's just not, embraced externally. So I would hope so, right? It would be great. Like if they were the fastest one to start up and use the least amount of memory with Helidon 4, that would shake things up a little. It'd be kind of cool, but I don't think it'll happen.
I missed a little bit of your presentation, but maybe you spoke about this. Have you tried the Ktor, Kotlin, and Kotlin native? Not the GraalVM version, but Kotlin native thing.
So the question is about Ktor for Kotlin. I've tried Ktor, but I haven't tried Kotlin native.
Yeah, because it uses absolutely different mindset for compiling things. So that's why it will be relying on the libraries that like Kotlin libraries. You cannot use Java stuff because they will compile a real binary that will be real native binary. And what we tried with Phantom from the Kotlin team, the Graal user experience is better because you don't need to worry about the libraries and stuff. It's just like, it will take some time to compile this.
Right.
But the time that it takes for like to start up a Ktor application that is like Kotlin native is faster. And the binary, you can literally write this binary that will be executed on like multiple platforms and even compile this into, I don't know, iOS.
So the recommendation is to try Kotlin native.
I tried Kotlin native. Probably like this is supposed to be James Ward comment.
Right.
He loves this stuff.
He does, yeah.
I think that he does also inspired me to try. And he actually did this type of stuff for some of the Google Cloud thing.
Okay.
Also like serverless use case to be Cloud Run. So you will be surprised. User experience would be a little bit kind of like janky because again, you need to use only libraries that existed for multi-platform. You cannot use any Java JVM libraries.
Right.
But if you need to write kind of like a nano microservices with native in the cloud, that's pretty cool.
So for the live stream, if you don't care about your Java knowledge, try Kotlin native because you might get faster startup times.
A lot of things, for example, they implemented full package for time. For example, it not uses Java time package, it uses Kotlin X date and time package.
Okay.
Same things that are available there, but they only implemented in Kotlin, so they will be used in the native.
So the challenge is, James Ward, if you're watching, we need a Ktor implementation in this repo.
I think it's good. Maybe I will.
All right, that'd be great.
One more question.
Spring Boot versus Quarkus runtime footprint on OpenShift environment. If there is a comparison, which would you think is smaller?
So the question was about Spring Boot versus Quarkus and runtime environment on what kind of platform?
Runtime footprint on OpenShift.
On OpenShift. I've never used OpenShift. I created an account, but I haven't run anything. I would imagine EC2 is similar. And basically Quarkus uses half the memory that Spring Boot does. But still, it's nothing compared to a Java app, right? Like it's under 100 megs. Java app's like 500 a gig, right? Kind of thing.
So running it under K environment would be a better thing to run Quarkus than Spring Boot.
I think you're going to get similar, right? Because it's just going to be, I mean, these are running an executable, right? And me timing that. I think Docker, I don't know if it's going to be faster or not, right? But if you're doing anything with Kubernetes, right, it's going to be in Docker first. So I think the Docker numbers that I will eventually gather would be what the Kubernetes might experience. But Knative might be another one, right? Because that's more of like the serverless kind of environment. And that's what you really want to deploy these native images into, is something that, shuts down when it's not being used and then starts up when it is. So that's the best I know about that. Did you want a piece of swag? Okay. What about you? You want a book or a dongle? Okay. Well, I'll save one for you up here. And then we're done?
Yep, we're done.
That's it? All right. Great.
Thank you, Matt, for that very, very detailed presentation.
So you can talk to the
And
live
thank you
stream.
for the microphone. And also, thank you very much to Betterment for hosting us tonight. Thank you again. So